Okay, and with that, I welcome everybody to this Better Brains for Babies webinar. And I would like to go ahead and introduce my friend Bradford Wiles. Bradford is an assistant professor and extension specialist at Kansas State University. He is also the first and currently only Better Brains for Babies master trainer, which means he has been through some extra training with us and now provides Better Brains for Babies training to people in the state of Kansas. So Bradford, I'd say to go ahead and take it away, and feel free to add anything that I didn't have to say about your background.
Great, thanks. I hope you all can see me all right. I know it's a little scary, but this takes time. Anyway, thank you, Diane. I will give just a very brief introduction. I have been at Kansas State for 5 years. I earned my undergraduate degree at Indiana in psychology and my graduate degrees in human development at Virginia Tech. In between my undergraduate and graduate degrees, I spent 7.5 years in Silicon Valley doing gene expression and microarray types of technologies. And so it's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to sort of bridge the two, heavily biochemistry laden areas with human development. And so I really appreciate all that Diane and her funders provide for us, and it's a real pleasure to be able to talk with you today about something that is sort of near and dear to my heart, and that is music and your brain. And before we begin, actually, I am going to just play this quick video here, and that should do that, and then it'll give you a good idea of sort of how everything goes. Diane, chime in if you can't hear me or hear this once it starts.
Talking about expectations.
Can hear it fine.
Ba, ba. Ba, 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 ba. Okay. What's interesting to me about that is, regardless of where I am, anywhere, every audience gets that. But it doesn't matter, that's just, the pentatonic scale for some reason.
If you're looking for a job in neuroscience, I think that...
All right, and the key with that is very much that music is essentially central to everything that we have sort of come to be. And what I love about what happens right at the end there is, first, he says, if you're looking for a job in neuroscience, because it is exactly that. There are multiple different things that happen in our brains as we listen to music. And then, if you noticed, he was also moving to music. And then Bobby McFerrin, very accomplished instrumentalist jazz musician. And so there are a lot of things that kind of go into that are really crucial for how we think about child development in the context of essentially a society in which we hear and are driven to move by music. So I'm going to give just sort of a very brief overview of brain anatomy today. I'll talk a little bit about the effects of listening to music and what happens in our brains when we do that. And keep in mind that everything that I'm going to talk about today is really very well studied. And there's one of my last slides, I have an extensive list of references that indicates all these. And in the notes sections, you'll find different things that have been sort of extracted from other articles. And so if you're interested in any of the basis for those things, they are contained. You will also have access to those slides. I think Diane might have posted those if you would like to get them. And then if you are looking for more information, there's a ton of different references there. So then we'll talk about dancing and moving. We'll talk about playing and learning to play music in the brain. And then I'll add a little bit about what we have for programs that are really helping us kind of leverage these things. And of course, Better Brains for Babies is one of those. So quick overview of the brain anatomy, really just looking at the left and right brain types of things. If you think about left brain functions, there are analytics, our logic, but that's also where we learn language, right? Science and math, numbers, and those things that we typically think of as kind of sciencey, but language is certainly often, particularly when it comes to poetry and songwriting and those things, more viewed as a right brain function, which is that art awareness, that creativity, imagination, intuition, right? And then you see it says music awareness, right? So this is the right brain is the part of our brains that make us aware of music, and the left brain really helps us analyze it and pick it apart. And so what happens in our brains when we start to listen to music? Well, we can think about all these different areas, right? Of course, there's the auditory cortex, which we know, right? I mean, we hear things, but then music is not benign to our brains. It elicits emotions in us, and those are within the amygdala, the hypothalamus, and then when we start to process those things on a more higher order cognitive functioning level, that's when our frontal lobes start to come in. And so, as we encode emotions, as we reference them, oftentimes it will have that musical component to them, but even more so when you listen to music, rarely do we have sort of a flat affect in relation to it. I mean, I imagine something like Muzak might be what elicits that, but generally we choose the music that we're listening to either to match the mood that we're in or to maybe switch the mood that we're in. And I think we all have some familiarity with how effective that is. We also have to exercise some inhibitory control, because one of the things that happens when you listen to music is there's some activation in the motor cortex, and it promotes this corticospinal excitability, and it causes this irresistible urge to tap your foot or dance or tap your thumb to the rhythm. And it's really fascinating because music often pumps blood to our extremities, and it is sort of what a lot of researchers sort of come to believe is what makes us want to tap our feet. And then in addition to that, there are of course the motor control components. So we often subconsciously or not move to music. And then you can also sort of, we have this phenomenon where in brain scans, the visual cortex is actually involved if you focus on the music, right? Not just sort of hearing it outside, but if you actually focus on it, there's a lot of excitement in the visual cortex. So they sort of term this as being able to see music. And it also, of course, releases dopamine, which is a pleasure neurotransmitters, or at least one of them that really gets to how we sort of why we enjoy music so much, right? It's a really nice release of dopamine that kind of does all the things that we want it to do. And so there are all kinds of really interesting implications for listening to music, and particularly as a lifespan developmental process. So I think those of you who have gone through the Better Brains for Babies training, what fascinates me the most about it is how often we focus on the critical periods in early childhood, and they are, make no mistake, they are super, super critical. And particularly when it comes to language and other and attachment and those things. But a lot of the things that we talk about have implications for lifespan developmental processes. There's some evidence around reminiscence therapy, and I have a link here that you don't need to. I won't pull up here, but it's really around the utility of using music as a way for older adults to be a lot more functional when they listen to the music from their teen years, from their youth. And in fact, there was just a recent study that I need to share with you all that indicates that the reason that we love the music or hypothesizes that the reason that we love the music of our youth is that was the music that was the soundtrack to our identity forming years, right? The music that you listen to in adolescence is what really solidified that, which is why for me, the music that I listen to is objectively much better than whatever an adolescent is listening to these days. But it's actually completely subjective, because that for me was the identity. And it just reminds me that Homer Simpson once said, "I don't even know why they try to make music anymore. They perfected it in 1974." Right? And it's exactly that we form our identities and our memories around the things that are sort of the soundtrack of our youth. We talk about it as the soundtrack of our lives, but it's actually really the soundtrack of your identity formation. And I think we all know this, right? That music positively affects our mood. For those who are athletes who listen to music, it really affects physical endurance. They're able to go longer, faster, and they're able to concentrate more. And then, and of course, the pain relief element of that too, right? And this isn't just for athletes, but there has been some extensive study in endurance athletes, and they find that when they listen to music, they have much higher abilities to ignore pain, and then of course across all different domains. What is fascinating to me about listening to music in particular is that the effect on social skills, that listening to music has this ability for us to be calm and be able to relate better to one another. And I will say, I imagine that some of that, the actual type of music, has some implication for that. But to flip that, though, we also know, and you all know because you've been through their Better Brains for Babies program, that there's no Mozart effect on babies, right? But the study looked at 3,000 people, and it was a meta-analysis of 40 different studies. And what they found was that those who listened to music, whether it was Mozart, Bach, or even Pearl Jam, had better results than silence. But we already know that. We already knew that people who are trying to perform a task will do better if they have a stimulus. The lead author recommends that everybody listen to Mozart, but it's not going to improve your cognitive abilities, as some people hope. I think we all understand that. But it does sort of reinforce, though, that listening to music is better than silence. So the next step, though, as we think about what we do with music, is we dance. And one of the articles I read really talked about dance as this sort of pleasure double play, because it stimulates the brain's reward centers, and music does that, right? What we just talked about, the dopamine release. But then it also activates our sensory motor functions, right? So, and allows us to engage in those things that I talked about earlier, where we actually have to inhibit our motor functions when you're listening, right? You want to tap your toe, but when you're dancing, you get to tap your toe and you get to move. And so it's actually a much more, again, sort of a doubling up, where you don't have to exercise that inhibitory control. You actually get to leverage that. What's really fascinating about dance when it comes to things like obesity prevention and endurance and those things is that it's very similar to other physical activity, playing soccer or running, but it's the social interaction that really helps. And so in the long term, there's this reduced risk of dementia, but in young children, it actually gets at all of these things that we know are really important, right? In early childhood, where there's a serve and return. I mean, if you think about dancing together, that is almost the most serve and return oriented type of activity one could even think of, right? That you have to work together, and actually if you think about it, there's always a lead, right? Somebody's leading and somebody's following, right? So it's back and forth and back and forth. And when the leader detects that the follower is done with whatever segment that is, then the leader then shifts again. And so we find that over time there's this reduced risk of dementia, but in early childhood, there are profound implications, though, for how it affects childhood neurochemistry and neurostructures, right? So we get all the benefits of music, but then we get to talk about planning, motor control, execution of the voluntary movements, right? Particularly in the motor cortex, which is essentially right up, if you recall your lessons, it's really this band that goes right across the top of the head right here. It's sort of in between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. There's this band that goes across. And then the motor control and hand-eye coordination, right? Because dancing requires both hand-eye and foot-eye, if you will. And then, as we know, the smooth coordination of movement is so crucial in dance. In fact, how dancing competitions are judged is really based on all of the things that we're looking at on this screen, right? The motor cortex, like how well we plan, control, and execute, and how well we flow together, particularly smoothness, right? That you've seen dancers where it looks jerky, and that's because it's out of sync. It's not completely coordinated. And that's not so much the individual basal ganglia, but it's the serve and return interactions. And then, of course, we get down to sort of the little brain, the cerebellum, and we have to integrate our sort of balance and fine motor skills, as well as really pull it all together. And so I think you can see that for young children, dancing to music is really beneficial. And in fact, often music and movement are required in early childhood classrooms. I would say that one thing that we could do that would be really helpful is being intentional about the kinds of movement that we use and the kinds of types of music that not only do we dance to music, but then we do even more in terms of creation of music. And so we looked at that in the context of early childhood. But again, dance is also a lifespan developmental process. So there are all kinds of really fascinating studies of dance as a protective factor against falls. But if you think about it, and in the Better Brains for Babies curriculum, one of the things we talk about all the time is pruning or atrophy, right? And it's use it or lose it. These things are use it or lose it propositions. Well, when we know that people dance, have better balance, they have better motor planning. Again, let's just go back, right? They have better planning, control, execution. This is in early childhood, but these things all flow through. And so you have this sort of practiced ability to protect against falls, or what they often term in the gerontological literature as slips and trips. It's also been demonstrated as therapy for Parkinson's disease. And then there are some trials of using dance as a protective factor against dementia. Again, one of the things that happens as our brains age is really this idea that things that don't get used atrophy. And knowing what we know about dance and how, if you look at the diagram there where the brains are connected, and if we go back here, the brains are connected again, that we know that those connections are so crucial for preventing dementia and Alzheimer's, right? And so dance is just this really, really tremendous opportunity for us to connect with one another in a healthy and active and physical way. Right. So I'm going to play another quick video here that is really helpful, and I'll come back to this. But the third sort of layer on top of this is how learning to play instruments affect the brain. So I'm going to go there. I'm going to try to do share. There we go. And I trust you can all see my screen trying to load right now. Trying to load.
Did you know that every time musicians pick up their instruments, there are fireworks going off all over their brain? On the outside, they may look calm and focused, reading the music and making the precise and practiced movements required. But inside their brains, there's a party going on. How do we know this? Well, in the last few decades, neuroscientists have made enormous breakthroughs in understanding how our brains work by monitoring them in real time with instruments like fMRI and PET scanners. When people are hooked up to these machines, tasks such as reading or doing math problems each have corresponding areas of the brain where activity can be observed. But when researchers got the participants to listen to music, they saw fireworks. Multiple areas of their brains were lighting up at once as they processed the sound, took it apart to understand elements like melody and rhythm, and then put it all back together into unified musical experience. And our brains do all this work in the split second between when we first hear the music and when our foot starts to tap along. But when scientists turned from observing the brains of music listeners to those of musicians, the little backyard fireworks became a jubilee. It turns out that while listening to music engages the brain in some pretty interesting activities, playing music is the brain's equivalent of a full-body workout. The neuroscientists saw multiple areas of the brain light up, simultaneously processing different information in intricate, interrelated, and astonishingly fast sequences. But what is it about making music that sets the brain alight? The research is still fairly new, but neuroscientists have a pretty good idea. Playing a musical instrument engages practically every area of the brain at once, especially the visual, auditory, and motor cortices. And as with any other workout, disciplined, structured practice in playing music strengthens those brain functions, allowing us to apply that strength to other activities. The most obvious difference between listening to music and playing it is that the latter requires fine motor skills, which are controlled in both hemispheres of the brain. It also combines the linguistic and mathematical precision in which the left hemisphere is more involved with the novel and creative content that the right excels in. For these reasons, playing music has been found to increase the volume and activity in the brain's corpus callosum, the bridge between the two hemispheres, allowing messages to get across the brain faster and through more diverse routes. This may allow musicians to solve problems more effectively and creatively in both academic and social settings. Because making music also involves crafting and understanding its emotional content and message, musicians often have higher levels of executive function, a category of interlinked tasks that includes planning, strategizing, and attention to detail, and requires simultaneous analysis of both cognitive and emotional aspects. This ability also has an impact on how our memory systems work. And indeed, musicians exhibit enhanced memory functions, creating, storing, and retrieving memories more quickly and efficiently. Studies have found that musicians appear to use their highly connected brains to give each memory multiple tags, such as a conceptual tag, an emotional tag, an audio tag, and a contextual tag, like a good internet search engine. So how do we know that all these benefits are unique to music as opposed to, say, sports or painting? Or could it be that people who go into music were already smarter to begin with? Neuroscientists have explored these issues, but so far they have found that the artistic and aesthetic aspects of learning to play a musical instrument are different from any other activity studied, including other arts. And several randomized studies of participants who showed the same levels of cognitive function and neural processing at the start found that those who were exposed to a period of music learning showed enhancement in multiple brain areas compared to the others. This recent research about the mental benefits of playing music has advanced our understanding of mental function, revealing the inner rhythms and complex interplay that make up the amazing orchestra of our brain.
Okay. So I hope y'all were able to kind of...
Do we know yet why this exists? Do we have an understanding of what's going on inside the brain case?
So we actually do not have brain scans of child prodigies before they became...
All right. Apologies for that quick delay. So what you have here is in this diagram is a nice little look at exactly what is going on when we're playing and listening to music. And of course, one of the things that's really fascinating about playing instruments is you are in fact playing and listening to. Not only are you playing and listening to your own instrument, but oftentimes you are listening to the other instruments that are playing around you and trying to figure out the timing, where you fit in, how loud you are, whether you're hitting the right notes or not, and then also trying to differentiate those things. And one of the things that I've come to understand more and more is that some people just sort of, I won't go so far as to say naturally, but have an orientation towards being able to break out different parts of any particular musical arrangement. So for me, if someone said, listen to the bass line, it would be very easy for me to listen to the bass, or, listen to that hi-hat. I could pick out that hi-hat very, very easily. And others have a much harder time. They sort of see the forest, but not the trees. Whereas people who tend to play music and learn how to and know how to read music are able to actually see the forest and the trees. So they're able to pick out these elements that are extraordinarily sort of easy for them to do, whereas for others they have to really strain. They have to have a lot more cognitive load. The other element that in that video that I think is really important that they touch on, but is sometimes lost, is that that there are elements of practice to it, right? Learning to play is not the same as learning and playing. And so you need, as with anything, we have to keep practicing it. It is tedious. It is not easy. Ask any professional musician, anyone who has gotten really good at their instrument, and they'll tell you that they had to practice. They had to practice. They had to practice. There are very, very, very few prodigies out there, and those who are always even talk about the benefits of practice, right? But what I love the most is this notion that it's so much further outside of just anything having to do with music. I mean, yeah, I can do those things with music where I can pick out melodies and harmonies and each individual instrument, or even two instruments together, or those things. But, and I say anyone who does this, it's more than that. It's the creativity, it's the memory, right? It's the executive function types of things that we talk about all the time in early childhood as being sort of the goal of building executive function. And if you recall, in the new set of slides, executive function, if I recall correctly, the slides leading right up to that are the serve and return component, which is exactly what you're doing when you're playing music with other people, right? You are serving and returning, you're listening and going back and forth. And so this notion of it being a full brain workout, I just absolutely love that as the moniker, because that's exactly what it is. And so, but we want to know sort of, kind of what is it that that differentiates, right? One of the things that we know is that musicians rate negative emotions in music as more arousing. So if we hear a sad piece of music, it's sadder to us, right? It actually evokes more. We also in music that is made to show fear. I need to post that. There's a great video of someone walking down a path, and the music is same video, two different types of music, and the one that that has the fear music, and everybody knows this, right? It's like high violins going like you're really afraid. Musicians tend to see those as more fear invoking, but there are, anyway, in the notes on the slides that you get, there are all kinds of really interesting results from studies. So I don't want to sort of belabor that too much, but I do think that as we think about what playing music does, it's not simply the benefits to being able to play music, right? So there are all kinds of differences in function. There are the emotional states that I talked about, but also musicians tend to have sort of different baseline emotional states. Those who, and when I say musicians, I want to be really clear. Those are people who know how to read music, who practice regularly, and have been trained, right? Those are sort of the three big markers that people, there's the classic joke, how do you confuse a guitar player? And the answer is you put sheet music in front of them. And in fact, that's very often the case. For example, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones does not read music. He's a tremendous guitar player, no idea how to read music, has no use for that. But I think that as I pointed out there, these differences in how we function, and particularly executive function, are really salient and are something that working with young children and their families, we can really build on. And again, the element of learning music is part of being a musician, but it's not the only, being able to read, but it's not the only way to do it. For example, learning to play drums incorporates all of these different elements in it, and there is different notation for drummers, but we can work on rhythm and melody and things in very young children. We can talk about the structure now. There are all kinds of research that indicates that the corpus callosum is stronger, larger, and information flows more freely between it. There's, as the video showed, much more interhemispheric coherence, meaning the signals that go back and forth across our hemispheres are much quicker and more easily interpreted. And again, it just gets back so much to the use it or lose it component that the Better Brains for Babies curriculum really emphasizes, that these things happen because we do them. And then again, playing music engages the visual, auditory, motor cortices. We've seen this before, right? It's listening to and dancing to as well. So the components of listening to music as a lifespan developmental process, and really playing music as a lifespan developmental process are really quite profound, right? That only learning and playing music has these benefits. And one of the things that we know through a number of different studies is that it's much easier for developing children to learn how to play and learn how to read music. And so one of the things that we can do as we work with different policy systems and environments is encourage music as a way to increase these executive function things. What are we dealing with in our public school systems across the United States? What are the budgets that are cut? Art and music, right? And yet we know that music learning has profound effects on executive function. What do we want when people graduate from high school or college? We want strong executive function skills. We want math skills. We want reading skills. We want people who believe in themselves, right? And then what do we want in older adulthood? Well, we want people that are able to live longer and healthier lives. And we see that there's this slowing of cognitive decline. Makes sense, right? You're not atrophying. There's the use it or lose it proposition. And then in young children, there's this plasticity as well, where the metaphor I always use is that of I grew up on a dirt road, and when I was young, there was no traffic. If a car went by that we didn't recognize, it was strange. But as I got older, they put down then oil and chips, and that's sort of this like asphalt gravel hybrid. And then as I got older and there were more people moving around, it became asphalt. And then as even more people came, it became a 3-lane road rather than a 2-lane. And so there's, a turn lane in the middle and 2 1 lanes going either way. And then as there's more and more traffic, the road would be built more and more and more and wider, allowing more flow. And that's exactly how our neural networks work, right? So if we're thinking about these things that we want to build, right, the more math skills that we practice in early childhood when our brains are plastic, and even into I should say not just early childhood, but in childhood, the more traffic there will be, the more those networks will be built, and then the more information can flow freely, right? You don't want to try to bottleneck all of this information into a little gravel road, right? And so what we find is that those adults who have worked in on learning music and practicing it throughout their lifespans have a much higher rate of long-term positive brain processing. Those who are more prone to Alzheimer's and dementia are generally not those who have practiced music or played music throughout their lifespan. It's one thing to learn it when you're young. It's another thing to continue to use it. And then finally, I do want to emphasize that it's not just children or adults. It's both and it doesn't mean just older age. I mean, I'm 44 years old. And the benefits are incredible in terms of spatial reasoning, your ability to recall memories. And again, keep in mind, these are outside of sort of music-related memories. It's more that because you're practicing memory skills, right? Each of us remembers. So if you think about a musician who's learning, they remember pieces of music and parts of it so that they can practice. And let me say, people that are really good at reading music don't and are performing, they don't actually read the music there. They already know the music so well that by the time that they're performing it, they already know it. It's there for them just in case, but it is just in case. So they're practicing their memories, and then they get better at memory and other things, right? And then we also find that they have higher abilities in working memory. So imagine if they're learning a piece of music that is, let's say, 16 measures long. Eventually, they'll learn a piece that's 32 and 64. And again, that spills over into other domains. And that's really crucial as we think about these things. So I've got a little bit of time for questions. I also know that Diane's got some information for you. But there's some key take-homes to to the implications for music. The first is, and I hope that the video up front, it is actually my favorite video on YouTube, demonstrated for you how universal music is, that no matter where Bobby McFerrin goes, he can play the audience just like that, right? And you can do that too. It's amazing. We are so wired for music and for it as part of the human existence that he can just stand in one place and give a sound and then move back and forth and give another sound. But then when he doesn't, the key with that is he doesn't give the third sound, but people know what that third sound is. There's very little variation in that third sound, meaning people aren't too high or too low. They're right there. They're right on it because of how universal it is. In the end, there are still incredible benefits to just listening to music, right? It's certainly there's no Mozart effect, but we also know how beneficial listening to music is for us and for our brains and our bodies. And then especially as we age, being able to, the music of our identity forming years helps us remember those things, has all kinds of implications for the way that we the way that we process our memories. In preparation for this webinar today, I was doing a little bit of reading, and there's a neuroscientist who works with a guy named Mickey Hart, who is a percussionist, and he took the neuroscientist who's at University of California at San Francisco, took a gentleman who had been suffering from Alzheimer's dementia to a concert, and he hadn't spoken literally in years. And in the first words he said, it was a Grateful Dead concert, and he said, "Where's Pigpen?" Well, Pigpen was a singer and harmonica and organ player who died in 1971. But the first words this guy had spoken in 5+ years were evoked by singing this music. And so I recognize that's sort of an anecdotal kind of thing, but we know how much music affects our memories and affects our ability to recall information. Dancing is a tremendous opportunity for us to work with one another as humans, using all these things that music and movement do. And I think I've covered that enough. So, but just those benefits are so they're profound. And then finally, playing an instrument bridges all of these things. And I do want to say, learning to play an instrument in your adult life is not impossible. It is just difficult. Much like learning another language is not impossible. It's just difficult. But it does have really important implications. And the more that we can expose young children to music and its benefits, think about all the things that we want our adults to be. We know that music and learning music is a tremendous way to evoke those things. And I'll just say, while I appreciate all the art and creativity and all that goes into it, I'm very much a pragmatist. And for me, it's the functionality that you get out of it. It's the ability to engage in executive function, to manage your emotions better, to be able to work and get along with other people better. Those are the things that people want when they're getting jobs. And so we can teach those things. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to ask you for a little bit. So obviously, the Better Brains for Babies curriculum that we use here in Kansas and Georgia and other states really gets at some of these the parts of the brain that really are excited by music, and I hope I've connected with those. And then here in Kansas, we have a program that I co-developed with some of my students around using dance as a healthy family engagement activity, healthy and active family engagement activity. It's called Family Dance. And if any of you went to the National Health Outreach Conference, you got a little bit of dose of that as well. So we started out with tap dance. And if anybody's interested in that, please reach out to me, contact me. My contact information, I believe, was on the invite, and I think that I did not include it here, but I will certainly put it in the chat box. But if anybody has any others that are really focused on using music or movement as a program to help engage families with children, I would be extraordinarily interested in them. So please put them in the chat box. And then finally, I'm open for questions. We have about 9 minutes left. I tried to get to 10 minutes, but I know that I sometimes go a little long. And then I have this evaluation here, but I know Diane has one from her funders. So please fill out the one from Diane, and she'll share those results for me. But I would now like to open up for question, and then also let Diane pass on the information that she needs to
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bradford, for all of this great information. We've had a couple of questions come in on the chat box here from Rachel Bartlett. Does singing regularly, such as in a choir, have a similar effect as playing a musical instrument?
So the answer is yes, for the most part. The key with singing in choir is if you are using your voice as instrument, meaning you're learning, you're reading music and positioning yourself within the context, absolutely. The voice is definitely an instrument, no question about it. The only major difference is that you're not actually motor planning, you're not doing anything with your hands, right? So, I've got like my little travel guitar that I keep in my office all the time, right? And so, there's none of the motor components, right? And so that's the only main difference. But a lot of the benefits you will get, because again, it's that serve and return component, right? Where you're finding your place in other locations and relative to other people. You're also listening to music while producing it. So Yeah, don't sell yourself short there. Singing in a choir is a wonderful thing to do.
Awesome. Another question also from Rachel. She asks, you mentioned it would be helpful to be intentional about the kinds of movement and music used in early care and education settings. Could you elaborate a little on what that might look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I have observed in many early childhood classrooms, and oftentimes it's essentially kind of a free-for-all during the music period, right? Where it's sort of like, we're going to put on some music, run around, we might teach you some steps or something to that effect. And so when I talk about being intentional, it's very much about having some structured activities. So, again, I use tap dance, and if you're interested in that at all, I have a bunch of different videos to help you. And by the way, 4-year-olds can grasp this. I've learned. Now, what's interesting is that adults are much more interested in the mastery than the 4-year-olds are. But what I would say is, if you're going to leverage the importance of moving to music and that motor planning component, then having a structured idea of what you want to do. Again, these are for 3, 4, 5-year-olds. I don't expect mastery. I don't think anybody does, but at least having a set goal, a set standard to try to achieve actually will provide much more of that intentionality in terms of motor planning, motor coordination, and having a standard to try to approach. Again, mastery is not the goal, but it does sort of leverage much more the benefits of music and movement.
Bradford, do you know of are there structured music and movement types of curricula or activities that you know of that are good for early care settings?
Right. So, we use the one that we generated here because we hadn't found any yet. But, I will say I need to revisit that a little bit, but I'm happy to share our curriculum with you. And I can certainly provide Diane with it's all online. If you want to do some training, please let me know, and we can figure out how I can get down to you. But we have some really tremendous curriculum that can be used to help. We have tap dance, and then what happened was whenever I would I had a playlist, and I would use the Bee Gees, "You Should Be Dancing," as the background music, and inevitably we all know what happened, right? Yeah, people started doing disco. So now I have a disco component for adults and young children, and we're also working on jazz and some swing dancing as well. Again, there are a lot of implications. Adults are much more concerned with mastery than young children. But yes, I have that as a resource, and then I can do a little bit more digging to see if we can find other sort of comparable products.
Great. One more question, or a couple of questions coming through. Marilyn Ward is asking about, she teaches through poems and songs. Do you think that poetry has some of the same effects because of its rhythms?
So certainly it does. I'm biased, but yeah, certainly. And in fact, if you look at children's literature, almost always it's rhythmic and rhyming, right? And so I certainly would never discourage poetry as a means. What I would encourage is children to be able to move during that. Providing activities or instruction that allows them to actually respond to the poetry in some movement or music oriented way. It's not that, and again, it's not that any of these activities are not beneficial. It's just that knowing what we know, incorporating the music on top of the poetry is really sort of where you get the sort of most bang for your buck. But again, I would never discourage poetry. It's tremendous and extraordinarily beneficial, particularly for young language learners.
Awesome. We've also had a couple of people remind us about the I Am Moving, I Am Learning resource, and
Yes.
there is information about that online as well in terms of how to access that information and how to attend training and those kinds of things. I know that has been shown to be successful as well. So.
Yes, indeed. In fact, we used that here when I first got here in Kansas through the children youth training. I can't remember. It was CTAP. That was the grant. I can't remember the acronym.
Awesome.
I should.
Well, we are just about out of time, but I do want to thank Bradford again for his time. I am going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point.